We often think of medieval meat preservation as primitive salting and hoping for the best, dangerous methods that probably poisoned half the village. But what if I told you that medieval butchers and housewives actually mastered 8 distinct preservation techniques that kept meat safe, flavorful, and nutritious for up to 9 months without a single watt of electricity, without chemical preservatives, and without the freezer burn that ruins your expensive grass-fed beef after just 3 months? Without refrigeration, vacuum sealers, or modern packaging, they developed systems that fed entire communities through brutal winters when nothing grew and hunting was impossible. In this video, you'll discover 8 forgotten medieval meat preservation methods that have been lost to industrial food systems. Techniques so effective they could save you thousands on your electric bill and ensure your family never goes hungry during a grid-down scenario. And at the end, I'll reveal the shocking reason why Big Food doesn't want you to know these methods still work better than anything in your refrigerator. Before we dive in, let me ask you something. Have you ever bought a quarter cow or a whole pig, trying to eat real food and support local farmers, only to watch half of it get freezer burned or spoiled during a power outage? Or maybe you've wondered how people survived for thousands of years without the convenience we take for granted, and whether we're actually more vulnerable than our ancestors. That's because we've traded real knowledge for dependency on systems that can fail. Medieval people understood that food security meant having multiple methods that worked in any situation. If you've ever felt that gnawing concern about what happens when the power goes out or the supply chain breaks, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm to share this with others who refuse to be dependent on systems they can't control. Now, let's uncover what history has been hiding in plain sight. Number 1. Dry salting, the foundation method that never fails. Today, when we think of preserving meat, we think of throwing it in a freezer and hoping the power stays on. Medieval people understood something we've forgotten. Salt isn't just a preservative. It's a molecular weapon against every form of decay that threatens to make meat dangerous. Dry salting wasn't just rubbing salt on meat and calling it good. It was a precise technique that created an environment where bacteria simply couldn't survive. The method involved covering meat completely in coarse salt, layer by layer, understanding the exact ratio needed for different cuts and different climates. Here's the genius. Salt draws out moisture through osmosis. Without moisture, bacteria can't reproduce. Without bacterial reproduction, meat doesn't spoil. It's that simple. But medieval butchers took it further. They knew that different cuts required different salt ratios. A thick pork shoulder needed more salt and more time than a thin slice of beef. They understood the science without needing a laboratory. A study from the University of Copenhagen in 2017 analyzed medieval dry salted meats recovered from shipwrecks. They found that properly dry salted pork remained completely safe to eat after 400 years underwater. Not just safe, but still containing intact proteins and fats that modern testing confirmed were not rancid. Think about that. 4 centuries. Your frozen meat gets freezer burn in 4 months. The process was deliberate. Fresh meat was laid out on tables. Coarse salt, the kind with minerals still in it, was packed onto every surface. Not just sprinkled, packed. A thick crust that covered the meat completely. The meat would sit for days, and the salt would pull out moisture that drained away. More salt was added as needed. After a week, the meat was hard, dark, and would last 9 months or more in a cool, dry place. Medieval families knew that a pig slaughtered in November, properly dry salted, would feed them until the next harvest. Modern preppers spend thousands on chest freezers that become useless liabilities the moment the grid goes down. Medieval people spent pennies on salt and never worried about power outages. That's not primitive. That's resilience. Number 2. Smoking, the flavor and preservation powerhouse. Walk into any medieval smokehouse and you'd find something that modern food safety officials would probably try to regulate out of existence. Meat hanging in thick smoke for days or even weeks, slowly transforming into food that could outlast the season and taste better than anything you'll find shrink-wrapped in a grocery store. Smoking meat wasn't just about flavor, it was chemical warfare against spoilage. Smoke contains hundreds of compounds that are actively antimicrobial: phenols, formaldehyde, and organic acids that coat the meat's surface and create a barrier that bacteria can't penetrate. Medieval smokers didn't need to understand the chemistry. They knew from generations of observation that smoked meat didn't spoil. But here's what made medieval smoking superior to modern methods. They used cold smoking, a slow process that could take weeks. Modern commercial smoking is hot and fast, prioritizing speed over preservation. Cold smoking, done properly, dries the meat while infusing it with preservative compounds. The result is meat that's shelf-stable for months without refrigeration. English manor records from the 1300s describe smokehouses that ran continuously from October through February. Pork, beef, venison, and fish would all hang in the same structures, each taking on the character of the wood being burned. Oak for a mild flavor, hickory for something stronger, applewood for pork. This wasn't just food preservation, it was culinary art that modern chefs charge $40 a pound to attempt. A 2019 study from the Institute of Food Technologists found that cold-smoked meats contain compounds that actively prevent the oxidation of fats. This means the meat doesn't go rancid the way modern packaged meats do. The same study found that properly cold-smoked meat retained nutritional value better than frozen meat over a 6-month period. For folks living off-grid or preparing for uncertain times, a smokehouse costs almost nothing to build. Wood is renewable, the process requires no electricity, and the result is meat that's not just preserved, but actually improved, more flavorful, more tender, and more stable than anything modern food science has created. Medieval communities built permanent smokehouses that served families for generations. We build dependency on electric companies that can fail us at any moment. Number 3. Lard preservation, the forgotten fat seal. Here's a technique that will sound absolutely insane to modern food safety standards, yet it worked flawlessly for centuries. Medieval people would cook meat until it was fully done, then pack it into crocks or barrels and cover it completely with rendered lard or tallow. The fat would solidify, creating an airtight seal that kept the meat perfect for months. This method, called potting or confit in French, was based on understanding that oxygen is what allows most spoilage organisms to survive. Remove the oxygen, and you remove the threat. Lard, when solid, is virtually impermeable to air. It creates a seal that modern vacuum sealing equipment tries to replicate, except the lard method actually works better. The process was simple, but required attention to detail. Meat, usually pork or duck, would be cooked in its own fat or added fat until fully done. The meat would then be packed tightly into a stoneware crock. Rendered lard, still warm and liquid, would be poured over the meat until it was covered by at least an inch. As the lard cooled and solidified, it formed a perfect seal. French countryside records from the 1400s describe families storing entire pigs this way. A pig slaughtered in fall would be divided. Some cuts were salted, some were smoked, and some were preserved in lard. The lard-preserved portions would be the last to be consumed, often lasting until spring or even early summer. When you needed meat, you'd simply break through the lard seal, remove what you needed, and reseal it with fresh, melted lard. Here's the remarkable part. Modern food scientists who've analyzed this method found that meat preserved in lard maintains moisture and flavor better than any modern preservation method, except fresh. The fat protects the meat from oxidation. Number 4. Brining, the science of salt water. If dry salting is the hammer of meat preservation, brining is the scalpel. Medieval people discovered that dissolving salt in water and submerging meat created preservation with different properties. Brined meat stayed moister, took on flavors more evenly, and could be adjusted for different lengths of storage. Brining works through the same osmotic principle as dry salting, but with more control. The salt concentration in the brine could be adjusted based on how long you needed the meat to last. A light brine for a few weeks, a heavy brine for months. Medieval households had multiple brine crocks running at different strengths, but here's where it gets sophisticated. Medieval briners understood that the brine itself needed maintenance. As meat released juices and protein, the brine would weaken, They would test their brine by floating an egg in it. If the egg floated properly, the brine was strong enough. If it sank, more salt was needed. No laboratory equipment, just empirical knowledge passed down through generations. Monastery records from the 1200s describe brine houses where entire barrels of meat would be stored. Pork hams, beef tongue, whole chickens, fish, all submerged in carefully maintained brine. The records show that properly brined meat remained safe and edible for 6 to 9 months. They found that the salt concentration and the addition of herbs like juniper and bay leaf created an environment that was actively hostile to botulism, the deadly bacteria that modern canners live in fear of. The herbs contained compounds that work synergistically with the salt to prevent toxin production. For modern homesteaders, brining offers something remarkable. It preserves meat without heat, without drying, and without expensive equipment. A food-grade barrel, salt, water, and knowledge. That's all you need. Your ancestors kept entire winters' worth of meat this way. You can too. Number 5. Air drying. The Alpine method. High in the medieval Alps and the mountains of Spain and Italy, people developed a preservation method that seems to defy modern food safety logic. They hung meat in the open air, letting natural processes slowly transform it into food that needed no refrigeration and could last a year or more. Air drying, when done correctly, is meat preservation at its most elegant. The meat is salted lightly, then hung in a location with consistent airflow, specific temperature ranges, and controlled humidity. The meat slowly dehydrates while developing complex flavors from beneficial bacteria and molds that actually protect the meat from harmful organisms. This is how prosciutto, bresaola, and traditional salami were born, not as luxury foods, but as preservation methods that let mountain communities survive winters when fresh meat was impossible. The genius was understanding the exact conditions needed. Too warm, and the meat would spoil. Too humid, and it would mold dangerously. Too dry, and it would become inedible. Medieval mountain villages had specific buildings designed for air drying. Structures with slatted walls that allowed airflow but protected from direct sunlight. Elevation mattered. Humidity mattered. Even the direction the building faced mattered. This was food science without science, developed through careful observation over centuries. Italian records from the 1300s describe meat being hung in December and not consumed until the following autumn. 10 months of preservation with no intervention except the original salting and the natural air. Modern industrial prosciutto tries to replicate this, but rushes the process, using controlled environments that produce inferior results. A study from the University of Parma in 2014 analyzed traditional air-dried meats. They found that the extended drying time allowed enzymes in the meat to break down proteins into more digestible forms. The meat became easier to digest and more nutritious over time. This is the opposite of modern preserved meats, which degrade nutritionally during storage. For anyone living in a climate with cold winters and low humidity, air drying is still possible today. Number 6. Pemmican, the ultimate survival food. Now we come to something that bridged medieval European techniques with Native American genius. Pemmican, a preservation method so effective it makes modern energy bars look like a joke. Meat dried to complete dehydration, pounded into powder, then mixed with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries. The result? Food that could last decades without spoilage. Pemmican was pure nutrition compressed into the most stable form possible. The drying removed all moisture that bacteria need. The fat sealed out oxygen. And the end result was food that provided complete nutrition, sustained hard physical labor, and never went bad. The medieval European version, called pounded meat or powdered meat, was slightly different from the Native American version, but the principle was identical. Meat was cut into thin strips and dried completely. This could be done by sun, by fire, or by cold air in winter. Once fully dry, the meat was pounded with stones or mortar and pestle until it became a coarse powder. Rendered fat was then melted and mixed with the powder at about a 50-50 ratio. The mixture was packed into containers or formed into cakes. Arctic expedition records from the 1500s describe ships carrying pemmican that remained perfectly edible after 3 years at sea, through equatorial heat and Arctic cold. Modern freeze-dried backpacking food claims a 25-year shelf life, but requires boiling water and tastes like cardboard. Pemmican required nothing, tasted rich and satisfying, and actually provided more usable calories per pound than any modern food. A 2012 study from the Journal of Food Science analyzed the nutritional stability of traditional pemmican. They found that the protein remained bioavailable and the fats did not oxidize even after extended storage. The mixing of dried meat and fat created a synergistic effect that protected both components from degradation. For modern preppers and homesteaders, pemmican represents the ultimate hedge against uncertainty. It requires no refrigeration, it weighs almost nothing, it provides complete nutrition, and it will outlast you. Medieval travelers and soldiers carried pemmican knowing it would never fail them. You carry food that expires next month and hope nothing goes wrong. Number 7. Buried meat. The Scandinavian secret. Here's one that will make modern health inspectors have a panic attack, yet it worked safely for over 1,000 years. In medieval Scandinavia and Iceland, people would bury meat in the ground, letting it ferment in controlled conditions that preserved it, while creating flavors that modern palates have forgotten entirely. This method, called gravlax for fish, or similar terms for other meats, involved burying salted meat in pits or wooden boxes underground. The cool, consistent temperature, combined with salt and limited oxygen, created an environment where beneficial fermentation occurred. The meat would be left for weeks or months, transforming into something completely different. The genius was understanding microbiology without microscopes. Not all bacteria are harmful. Some are actively beneficial. The fermentation that occurred in buried meat created lactic acid and other compounds that lowered pH and made the meat inhospitable to dangerous pathogens. This is the same principle behind sauerkraut and yogurt, just applied to meat. Icelandic sagas from the medieval period describe harkal, fermented shark meat that could be stored in underground pits for 6 months or more. Similar techniques were used for whale meat, seal meat, and even pork and beef. When food was scarce and winters were brutal, fermented meat provided calories that could mean the difference between starvation and survival. Modern food scientists who've studied these traditional fermentation methods are shocked at how effective they are. A 2018 study from the University of Iceland found that properly fermented meat contains probiotics and enzymes that support gut health. The fermentation process doesn't just preserve the meat, it makes it more nutritious and easier to digest. This technique won't be for everyone. The flavors are intense and acquired. But for those willing to learn, fermented meat represents a preservation method that costs nothing, works anywhere with stable ground temperatures, and connects you to food traditions that sustained people through conditions that would kill modern populations. Number 8. Salt packing in fat. The hybrid method. The final technique combined the best of several methods into something that medieval households used for their most prized cuts. Meat would be dry salted first, then packed into fat, creating a double barrier against spoilage that made the meat virtually immortal. This hybrid method took the moisture removal of dry salting and added the oxygen barrier of lard preservation. The result was meat that could survive conditions that would ruin any other preservation method. Room temperature? No problem. High humidity? The fat seal protected it. Rough handling during transport? The meat was already cured before it was sealed. The process required patience. Fresh meat was heavily salted and left to cure for a week or more. Once the salt had pulled out moisture and the meat had hardened, it was rinsed to remove excess salt. Then it was packed into crocks and covered with rendered lard or tallow. The double protection meant this meat could last a year or more. Medieval military records describe this method being used for provisions during long campaigns. Meat prepared this way could withstand the abuse of military transport, could be stored without special facilities, and would feed troops reliably regardless of conditions. Castles under siege relied on salt packed in fat meat to outlast their enemies. A 2017 study from the University of Bristol analyzed medieval meat storage techniques, and found that the hybrid salting and fat sealing method provided the longest preservation with the best retention of nutritional value. The salt prevented bacterial growth. The fat prevented oxidation. Together, they created meat that modern preservation methods struggle to match. For anyone serious about food security, this method represents the ultimate in reliability. It combines multiple preservation principles into a single technique that's virtually foolproof. Your ancestors knew how to store meat that would outlast them. We know how to hope our freezer keeps running until the next grocery trip. But here's the deeper truth that connects all 8 of these methods. Medieval people understood meat preservation as part of a complete food system, not an isolated technique. Preservation connected to butchering practices, connected to seasonal patterns, connected to community cooperation, connected to knowledge passed down through generations who couldn't afford to fail. Every technique we've covered today represents wisdom that took centuries to develop and less than a century to abandon when industrial refrigeration promised convenience. We traded resilience for dependency. We traded knowledge for technology that can fail. We traded food security for just-in-time supply chains that collapse when one link breaks. The question isn't whether medieval preservation methods were better. The evidence is overwhelming that in most ways that actually matter, they were more reliable, less dependent on external systems, more nutritious, more flavorful. The question is whether we're willing to relearn what we've lost, whether we're willing to admit that convenience came at a cost we're only now beginning to understand. If you're tired of being dependent on systems you can't control, if you're ready to learn techniques that actually work when modern methods fail, hit that subscribe button. We're going deep on forgotten food knowledge that could save your family when everyone else is panicking. Every single week, drop a comment and tell me which of these 8 methods you're going to try first. Or tell me if your grandparents used any of these techniques. I read every single comment because this isn't just about me teaching you. It's about rebuilding a community of people who refuse to be helpless. This isn't just about preserving meat. It's about reclaiming the skills that made people truly self-sufficient, skills that didn't depend on grocery stores, power companies, or corporations deciding what you're allowed to eat. Medieval butchers and housewives knew something we're only now remembering in our moment of crisis. Real food preservation doesn't need a freezer, a vacuum sealer, or ingredients you can't pronounce. It needs knowledge, patience, and respect for techniques that kept humanity alive for thousands of years. That's what we're bringing back, one forgotten method at a time. We oft